We're going to continue with our commentary on Mark. I think this is the 11th session, and we had left off with the baptism of Jesus last time. Previously, we had spoken about the heavens being torn open, uh, which I last time spoke of Jesus is having a revelation, a mystical experience of sonship, and we spoke about the messianic package that was delivered to him. You are my beloved son, with echoes of the so-called sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. And of course, in whom I am pleased, the first of the four or five songs of the servant in uh, second Isaiah, in this case Isaiah 42, and perhaps also Isaiah 61, which would be a fifth servant song in maybe third Isaiah, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the humble, and also this year of liberty, which is a jubilee liberation, forgiveness of all debts and sins that takes place on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, as described in Leviticus 16. The actual jubilee is described in Leviticus 25. And we also called this a bookend to the death of Jesus, where the temple curtain, whichever one of the two it is torn or split. Again, the Greek schizo verb, schizophrenia, split mind. This temple curtain is split from top to bottom, signifying an opening of access to God that Jesus, with his death and resurrection, will inaugurate. Josephus, the Jewish historian, speaks of this temple curtain, I think the outside one, as being decorated in the form of the firmament, so that you would have a correlation there. If it's the inner curtain of the Holy of Holies, then it's also opening up this space of intimacy with God, which only the high priest could enter once a year, precisely on Yom Kippur. And I also mentioned, just to repeat one last thing, which we want to do, because by repetition is how we can begin to assimilate many of these comprehensive things. In Isaiah 63, it ends with, would that you rend the heavens and descend. And so this word rend, open, is reminiscent of what we have just seen in Mark. I don't think it's the same exact vocabulary in Greek or Hebrew, for what Mark is using. But nevertheless, Isaiah also has this Second Temple Judaism hope that God will finally come down. And we'll be seeing that off and on um, in the gospel. What's interesting is that immediately the Spirit casts him out into the desert, so that you could expect that after a mystical experience, even Paul goes to, I think, the desert of Damascus or Arabia after his Damascus experience to meditate. And this is an old tradition. He remained in the desert 40 days being tempted by Satan. Mark does not describe what the temptations were. We could easily suppose that if this messianic passage was understood by Jesus correctly, as we must assume he did, he knew that this being a special beloved son, like Isaac, meant that God would not, his father would not spare him either, even though Abraham was spared from having to sacrifice his long desired darling boy. Jesus suspected, I'm sure, that he was not going to be spared. Precisely, probably in fulfillment of this fourth servant poem in Isaiah 53, it was our iniquities that he bore. The discipline, the musar of our shalom that brought us peace or salvation was upon him. We took him to be stricken, afflicted, smitten by God, but it was really, it pleased Yahweh to lay on him all our sins and iniquities. This awon in Hebrew is a crookedness. And you could almost say that Jesus assumed in his body the crookedness and disfigurement due to sin. You know, he had no form or beauty, so disfigurement in the servant's song. It's actually an ungrammatical form of this being disfigured. It's not correct. It's like a noun. So disfigurement. And the Qumranites would interpret that with, with a couple of changes of vowels or something as I so anointed you, which is incredible. We could get into that servant song on some other occasion. We would deviate too much from our topic. But this servant had no form or beauty. He was beyond recognition as one of the sons of men. And in fact, in the Jewish tradition, he's also the servant, the leper Messiah, who resides in Rome and is all bandaged up. There's a beautiful story. I can't resist telling it. I think in the Babylonian Talmud, where all the lepers are together in this, forget which person asked a rabbi, where do I find the Messiah? Oh, he's in Rome. He's hanging out with the lepers. Well, how do I recognize him? And he said, the lepers all changed their bandages all at once, but the Messiah changes them one by one in case he's called. So it's a tremendous story. And by the way, I have to tell you that in the sacrifice, so-called binding, as the Jews call it, the Akedah of Ezek, there's a book, I think by Judah Goldman. I'm not going to look it up now. The Jewish tradition regarding this Genesis 22 binding of Ezek has all this resurrection language, and all kinds of things were already explored by the Jews. And that's why the Catholic Church, in a document from 2001, 2002, the English translation, 2002, called the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible. It's about 200 pages. And it talks about all the Jewish methods of interpreting the Bible and how any Christian or anybody else who wants to be a Bible student has to be familiar with the Jewish tradition regarding biblical interpretation. So anyway, continuing here, he goes immediately, this is a Markan word, we already mentioned it, of urgency and fast-pacedness, goes to the desert. And you could even, I was talking this morning in Spanish for a radio station about Hosea, when Yahweh says, I will take her to the desert and speak to her heart and re-woo her again, or Israel in the desert. And oftentimes I see this desert period as symbolic of the 40 years when Israel rebelled and was tempted by Yahweh. In Deuteronomy 8, it's not Israel that tempts Yahweh, as in Numbers, and Massah and Meribah, Yahweh. Israel put Yahweh to the test. That's what tempted means. Temptatio in Latin. But rather in Deuteronomy 8, it says it was Yahweh who tempted you to see what was in your heart. As a man corrects his son, he's corrected you. Made you go through that terrible desert. So this desert is symbolic of a time of trial, and I think Jesus must have had to struggle, as he will in Gethsemane. He's going to say, Father, if it's possible, remove this cup. He began to be fearful. I think the translations of those words would indicate he was filled with terror, knowing what the Romans would do to you once they arrested you as an insurrectionist. So he's in the desert these 40 days, and Satan, of course, would be a prosecuting attorney, someone who puts you to the test. You can see him in the book of Job. He's part of the celestial court that meets every week, and he wants permission to put Job to the test. And in other places, this Satan is like a prosecuting attorney, devil's advocate, if you will, and the opposite would be the paraclete or the defense attorney, consoler. But Jesus, there's this tradition that he was tempted by Satan in the desert. And what's very interesting is the following line. And he was with the beast, this Therion. These are the wild animals that Adam is supposed to have dominion over in Genesis 1 and 2. And they represent the pagan nations that always oppress Israel. And of course, in a messianic passage like Isaiah 11, the lion becomes a vegetarian, the wolf lies with the lamb, all the animals become peaceful. Animals are not supposed to kill. The initial Genesis garden situation is a vegetarian situation, no killing. After the flood in Genesis 9, God allows killing of animals for food, which is a concession, but not the eschatological hope for finale. Killing humans is always prohibited, even for animals. So that you have this echo here of Jesus at peace with the beasts. And it's reminiscent of a beautiful passage in Ezekiel 34, which I call it the good shepherd part of Ezekiel, where Yahweh is angry at the abusive shepherds of Israel, which in the first place would be kings. It's been applied, especially in the church, to pastors, which means shepherd. Bishops and people like that lord it over and oppress the flock and abuse them. And then it says that I myself will shepherd them, Yahweh says. But then he says in Ezekiel 34:23, I will raise to put at their head one sole shepherd who will shepherd them, my servant David. He shall shepherd them and shall be their shepherd. I, Yahweh, will be their God, and my servant David shall be a Nazi. We already mentioned this, the lifted up one, or prince, oftentimes translated, which I don't like prince too much, in their midst. I will conclude with them, cut with them a covenant of peace. It's almost like a new covenant, eternal covenant, certainly in Ezekiel. I will make disappear from this land or this earth. It's in Hebrews the same. Edits the wild beasts, and they, look at this, they shall dwell safely in the desert and sleep in the forests. This is very reminiscent of what Mark is saying. They will not again be prey to the nations, the beasts. The beasts, the savage beasts will no longer devour them again. They will dwell in safety, and they shall not be disturbed again. So Jesus is getting a taste here of this situation. The other thing is that it says that the angels served him, deaconed to him. They use the Greek deacon verb, but here we have a reminiscence of an incredible passage that we'll have to continue next time. Daniel 7. Daniel 7, the potestas, authority, dominion is removed from these beasts and given to one like a son of man. And it says here in Daniel 7 that thousands and thousands served him, this Ancient of Days, and myriads were standing before him. This is an Aramaic, and they're using a ministry verb. I thought at first it was the word for sun, shemesh. And I had trouble at the beginning looking it up, but it's actually, I looked it up now, and it says it has to do with being able to work in daylight. But it's similar to not too similar to a Hebrew verb used for Joshua ministering to Moses. So here you have these angels ministering to Jesus in the context precisely of the beasts no longer lording it over, in the first place, over Israel. So the beasts are pagan nations. They come out of the sea. We'll see that later in Mark. And the authority, dominion that they have is taken away from them and given to one like a son of man. And on that note, we'll stop and continue with this and the rest of Mark, God willing, as we go along. Thank you.